now. Okay, so today we are talking about what is the Anthropocene in our ES1 class. This is one of my favorite pieces of art. I think it is fun. It is also a small little shout out to Billy, who comes from the fabulous Las Vegas, which the sign by Robin Woolston is modeled after. So, what is the Anthropocene? Yesterday, we talked about the sixth mass extinction. We're going to be talking about that a little bit more and how it's related to the Anthropocene. But um, just as a reminder, we have two reminders. One is that your weekly response is due Friday this week, not Thursday, but Friday at 11:59 p.m. So by Friday at 11:59 p.m., please answer both of the following questions in a PDF or docx file. So these two questions, you want to answer both of them. You want to make sure that you're digging deep. You want to make sure that you're connecting the materials that you read and watched and you heard about in class. You want to make sure that you're connecting some of the dots between lecture and class. You want to make sure that you're digging in deeply. What do I mean by that? Meaning, it means to explain the stakes of not only my question, but the stakes of how you're answering it, the stakes meaning how and why are these things important. So an example of how you can do that is after every sentence or every few sentences or after every kind of point that you make, you can just ask yourself, well, how does that happen? And then you don't write how, obviously, but you answer that question. And then you can try asking yourself how again, and then don't write it, but you can answer that question. And then you ask yourself, well, why? And you don't write why, and you answer that question. That is an example of digging deeply. That is an example, a quick way that you can make sure that you're doing analysis, which is really what I'm looking for. Your response, of course, I care about your opinions, and of course, I care about any potential personal stakes and connections that you have. But again, I want these things. I want these responses to be more in third person, more thinking about just how these things work in the world. And then if you do have any personal connections to them, potentially keep them brief. And that's when you use that first person I. But I want you to be thinking analytically, because these are in some ways warm-ups for your final paper, which will be more of an analytical paper in which you're focusing in on one environmental justice or environmental issue. Again, we'll talk more about that. Anyway, all of that is to say, I'm saying this because a couple have been turned in, and while they were really good, and I was super duper impressed that they were turned in early, those were just some recurring things that I saw in the handful that I've read so far that I just wanted to make sure that I highlight. Please make sure that you're doing some analytical thinking and really digging in deep, doing that work. So the two questions that you need to do that for are these. Skeptics often claim that we shouldn't worry about current climate changes because our planet has experienced climatic cycles in the past. We had an ice age, and then we didn't have an ice age. We had an ice age again, and it was so big that we got Beringia, the whole Bering Strait turned into a landmass that people crossed, and then it disappeared. We've had these climatic cycles before. So do you think that this true statement about past climate cycles is a reason not to be concerned? Explain. This question doesn't, I mean, none of these questions that I pose and argue, like most questions don't have a right or wrong answer, just generally, at least in the humanities side of things. However, you want to make sure that if you're taking maybe a less a more controversial stance, or basically if you're going to say something in the realm of like, we really shouldn't care about climate change, then you're going to need to explain why, because there are people who do believe that, and there are some good reasons to believe that and other less than solid reasons to believe that. So no right or wrong answer, but make sure that you clarify why you have the opinion that you have. Second question, the Anthropocene is the period during which humans have become a dominant force shaping our planet's environment. Given this week's materials, do you think the Anthropocene is the best term for what we're doing? Why or why not? If not, then what would be better? So I want you to answer both of these questions. Do you have to braid them, weave them together perfectly? No, no, you don't. Can they be woven and braided together beautifully? Yes, yes, they probably could. Billy and I are just really excited to see your answers for these, and just make sure that while you're doing it, that you are thinking analytically, you are thinking about the bigger stakes of what you're saying. That includes who's impacted, what is impacted, why does that matter, why should we care, how does that happen, etc., etc. So, generally speaking, these are out of 4 points. The I think threes, at least at in the beginning of the quarter, can be, pretty standard. For a bit, you have to really work hard for that four, at least in the first half of quarter. By the second half of quarter, we're all just trying our best, and you all will be focusing more on your final papers, though that isn't an excuse for later lackluster work, just more of a reminder that, if you do get a lot of threes, if you do get like threes on these first two responses, for example, or thereabouts, all is not lost. I Billy and I aren't here to hurt you. We are here to help you, and know that part of that help is just really kind of having much stricter not strict isn't even the right word, just being more discerning with who gets fours, at least in the first half of the quarter. So just keep that in mind. We're not here to hurt you, we're here to help you, we're here to help get you to be curious about the world of environmental studies. Some questions in the chat. When is the final essay due? Is it on July 29th? I would have to check the syllabus, and if I didn't specify in the syllabus, it'll be week 7. I want to say it's early. I want to say it's like August 2nd or something, but I need to double check. And that is a great question. I will put that in my lecture for Monday for you. So again, Ian has a question. What's up, Ian? Do you want to ask it in person or in the chat?
I was just going to ask it.
Yeah, sure.
Are you providing feedback on these responses?
Yeah, so it'll be Billy and I need to talk about it more because he is going to be grading these first ones. But I mean, I think a sentence or two. If you got a 4, it might just be something like "good work." If you got like less than that, there might be like a "hey, I'd like a little clarification here and here." If you have more questions, or if it's really bothering you for whatever reason, you can talk to me or you can talk to Billy. Yeah, just I hope that does that help, Ian?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sweet. And yes, in the chat, it's out of 4, so it's a 0 is that you don't turn it in. A 1 is like, well, you turned something in. Is it a picture of a puppy? All right, that's a 1. A 2 is like, all right, this is like a page of some like cognizant stuff. There are some connections going on here. A 3 is, a pretty solid answer, but just needs some tightening up. And then a 4 is, man, you knocked it out of the park. Good job. So I hope that helps. If we have more questions about it, or if there's like a revolt and like half of you are just intensely mad about getting 3s or something on your response paper, please come to me. Please don't come to Billy. He is I've worked with him closely on multiple projects. I trust his grading 100%. And he is, he is doing that work on my behalf. But if you have questions, feel free to revolt at me, not at Billy. Thank you so much. I don't see that happening. Billy is a kind, generous person. All right. Uh, Weekly responses aside, week two, again, week two is all asynchronous. What does that mean? It is all not at the time of class. It is all uploaded by Saturday, unless something really bad happens to me, then Sunday morning. Um, Everything will be uploaded and ready. Um, and it'll all be on the Gaucho Space. The links for lecture will be on the Gaucho Space. All you will do is click on that link. It will take you to the YouTube where that video will be. And this is the case because I will be doing a week-long internship in Redwood National Park where I will be working on a set of ranches from the 19th century that are all made out of redwood and need some preservation love. So I will be learning how to do a whole bunch of architecture things that I've never done. So the last time I was at these ranches, I was actually doing a different internship with a different association to do something that's called a cultural landscape report, where I assessed the environment and I also assessed the buildings, like these historical buildings on park property, and I'm really excited that I have the chance now to do some of the recommendations me and my fellow intern did a couple years ago. So super excited. It was an opportunity that I felt like I couldn't pass up, and so I thank you so much for being for not necessarily being willing, I'm kind of foisting this on you, but by participating in an asynchronous week. So weekly response will be posted, lectures will be posted, and I try to be quick with my email generally, but because I will not have internet connection reliably unless I go to town, I will answer email within 24 hours unless something really unforeseen happens. Hopefully it won't. If you don't hear from me in 2 days, like maybe call the Forest Service. I'm not sure. It'll probably be fine. Just know that email will take a little longer than it has, at least so far this week. Okay, so the Anthropocene. Welcome to the fabulous Anthropocene era. Let's get into it again. This is a picture I like so much by Robin Woolston, and she has a series of really cool installation artwork that's outside like this that are related to different geologic epochs and different different eras, and you can see if you can look them up if you are an art or geology or any sort of nerd. I think they're really fun. This one is the best in my humble opinion. So yesterday we talked about the sixth mass extinction, but in talking about the sixth mass extinction, we more talked about how we got there, and we didn't really talk too much about what it means. So the sixth mass extinction means that like a lot of species are dying. This is a big challenge for biodiversity because the total diversity of all life on Earth, that includes all levels of biological organization, that's what biodiversity is necessary to for the balance of all of the different ecosystems that make up our big system, which is planet Earth. So if you need a gentle reminder about taxonomy, here it is. We go, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and then genus, species. If you ever spend time studying species, you'll recognize genus, species from the taxonomic name, which is the Latin name. So biodiversity is still being measured. Biodiversity is something that is always in flux. Biodiversity is always kind of changing because our system is dynamic and the systems within these systems are very dynamic. It remains unclear how many distinct species exist on Earth. That's for a couple reasons. One is because it it is impossible without being extremely extractive and probably to the point of destroying much life on Earth to ensure that we know all of the life that is on Earth. It is impossible to get to every single corner of the world, even though the Anthropocene tries. Um, it's also unclear because the history of taxonomy, the history of especially sorting species into genus species, has been contested and is steeped in colonialism, steeped in capitalism. Names of names of especially plants, which has a longer history of being sorted, but also animals has changed over time. For example, redwoods, just again always comes back to my favorites. Redwoods have had three different taxonomic names just in the past 100 years. These things are contested, and because science is the best reliable, commensurate, so agreed upon knowledge that we have, um, sometimes little findings can change things and can change how we understand a species, which means that our understanding of biodiversity can also change and is in flux as well. There are many ways to measure biodiversity. Some of this is the species area curve that you can see here, which shows the total number of species per unit area. So the shapes of these curves may vary for different ecosystems. If you work at all with different species in the future, this is just the general appearance of the curve. For the most part, you can see it's my number of species versus, sorry, that habitat is cut off, but habitat right here. And this is a way that different environmental scientists keep track of how many species are where. So an example of this, California has many kinds of landscapes, but Amazonian rainforests, which is just one landscape, have many more species within that given landscape than, the different kinds of California landscapes. So Amazonian rainforests have hundreds, if not thousands, of different species just in that one landscape. Oh, obviously thousands. I was just thinking of animals, like thousands of different species, whereas Californian landscapes maybe have hundreds of kinds of species each. There is a general global pattern of biodiversity. Generally speaking, at least as of now, I wonder what it'll be in a couple decades with climate change, but biodiversity tends to be greatest in the tropics and lowest towards the poles, which you can see here. I keep getting people joining the waiting room and having to come in, sorry. So we can see the tropics have the most biodiversity, and then it becomes less rich the more you go up. Part of this has to do with the humidity and heat just being very good for most species to thrive. It takes a lot more kind of evolutionary changes to survive harsh cold. Of course, things happen. What is it in Jurassic Park that Jeff Goldblum says? Life finds a way, and so life does find a way, but it is going to be easier when it is more kind of moderate, warmer, and humid. Global diversity pattern. The global diversity pattern is complicated by regional differences. So there's 34 regions on the globe that are considered hotspots due to their density. So hotspots are 0.5% to 1,500. Having endemic species, endemic means natural or indigenous to the area, that can occur nowhere else. So again, gotta bring it back to my redwoods. Redwoods only really do well on the northern coast of California. My Germans who tried to take it over there had to do genetic manipulation to try to make them withstand any frost, withstand being away from a steady rain of fog away from the coastal air and away from the soil. Endemic species can are usually very important to the ecosystem. Um, they they have a lot of they provide different resources for other species in the ecosystem, and it can be very difficult to try to take them out of that place because it they have more barriers that makes it harder for them to evolve and adapt without much scientific tweaking, shall we say, to make it anywhere else. So these hotspots that we're talking about can vary by taxonomic group. So for example, amphibians are going to be more diverse in wet tropics than a European meadow. Just as one example, we also have to talk about the background rate of extinctions. So extinction, which is similar to speciation, kind of it's opposite, but extinction is a natural process. So over the past 65 million years, the background rate or average rate of extinctions in the absence of human action has been about 0.1 to 1 species worldwide per year. So that doesn't sound like a big deal. Um, However, things have been kind of speeding up a little. So, and this is where the mass extinction comes in. So, although some extinctions happen gradually over long periods, many have occurred during short catastrophic events, such as the event that annihilated many dinosaur species around 66 million years ago. And a mass extinction is defined as an event or period in which at least 50% of species on Earth go extinct. So yes, we are here in the sixth mass extinction. The current event began tens of thousands of years ago and has exhibited a series of waves as humans entered new regions, transforming their ecosystems and driving species to extinction. So you may remember from yesterday, we were talking about migration. We mentioned Beringia and the going over the Bering Strait, people moving. We talked about the out of Africa theory. All of these things in the bigger history of the world, history of the universe, really. But the history of the world, humans movement has really started the sixth mass extinction. There have been multiple opinion pieces that have now given forth to more academic and scholarly pieces thinking about, well, what does it mean for us to be in the midst of a sixth mass extinction? What could this lead to? So this piece talks about a tally of life under threat that, there have been different studies evaluating just biodiversity generally, evaluating, well, trying to evaluate at least how many species we do have and what would be a breaking point. How screwed are we going to be, really? And not to spoil things, but it is not looking great. So using the people joining class later, using the living Planet Index in 2018, the World Wildlife Fund found that global wildlife populations had declined on average by about 60% between 1970 and 2014. I just want to point out briefly this year, this flashpoint, 1970, should maybe be on your radar. Earlier this week, we talked about 1970 being the first Earth Day, 1969 with the Santa Barbara oil spill, but also a couple other really catastrophic environmental events, getting people to be aware of the environment, not just these environments that were literally on fire or literally engulfed in oil, but just generally around them. And when people start paying attention, some people start to take notes and collect evidence. And so a lot of this evidence, and lecture will be talking about evidence a bit more next week. A lot of these numbers that we get, especially bigger, kind of more global numbers, really start around 1970. So a few months after this more recent, to go back to 2018 with the World Wildlife Fund, a few months after that finding, the United Nations found that if current trends continue, up to 1 million species may be threatened with extinction. So what will this cute turtle do? How will they get through? And these are the questions that come about from a lot of environmental nonprofits. Yesterday, I started with a polar bear. That is another Polar bear is maybe one of the most emblematic species that works as a symbol against the sixth mass extinction, a symbol of climate change, a symbol of needing to do something, or else biodiversity is just going to plummet. And more, especially when we talk about the oceans having so many species that we don't even know. Turtles are starting to fill in that gap just a bit. So, why should we care about biodiversity loss? Why should we be concerned? There's a lot of reasons. We are in a big old system called planet Earth. That big old system called planet Earth has so many other ecosystems, and the success of the big system is reliant on all of the smaller systems keeping some sort of balance, having some flux, not just like with the seasons and with random occurrences, but generally speaking, a realm of stability. Without that, we have a lot of things that are threatened, like ecosystem services. The biggest one being water. We need water to survive. Everybody does. Maybe not like tardigrades so much, but most species, humans included, need water. Also, marketable products and services. So, besides water, also natural resources that we use. I'm looking at you, the oil industry. I'm looking at you, uranium. I'm looking at all of the other natural resources that we use to, especially humans. I mean humans when I say we, that we use to create modern life, but also create a sense of human stability, of social stability. We should also be concerned about biodiversity loss because of scientific knowledge, also because of instrumental uses. So, especially around the tropics, we have all of these different species, and so many medicines come from the tropics. We think about, modern medicine happening in a lab. Well, yes, but most of the time, they are recreating or manipulating things that we find in nature, and many of these come from the tropics. Pharmaceutical industries have been mining, like literally mining the tropics for hundreds of years. This work goes back to basically the at least 16th century. I wanted to say 15th with Columbus, but that wouldn't be fair. At least 16th century. This has been a long time coming, but we have been using nature forever. There's also some ethical concerns that come with biodiversity loss. What do we owe each other? What do we owe the planet? What does it mean for our actions, our being human actions, changing the world irrevocably? There's also I'd be remiss to not mention aesthetics. A biodiverse site, a site full of multiple trees flowing in the wind, and a field of many native grasses. Maybe I'm just painting my own fantasy, but with tons of different little and big animals just hanging out. That's beautiful. What's, at least in a general way, what's considered less beautiful? Probably like an asphalt road with some gravel next to it. Less pretty, just generally speaking. Nothing against roads. We should also be concerned with biodiversity because of biophilia. That is just like a love of life. Um, People have that in different doses, I would say, but generally speaking, humans tend to think that life is good. Life is a sign of our life continuing. And I think one of the biggest things, at least for me, is that we should be concerned with biodiversity loss for all of these important reasons that we need biodiversity not happening for the future. We need to, in my opinion at least, the biggest concern with biodiversity loss is that there's intergenerational distributive justice, meaning that future generations after us, if things keep going how they're going, are going to be less than ideal is putting it too softly. But it's going to be uh really desolate. We don't know exactly what it will be like, but there's going to be less access to all of these previous bullet points. And really, we just don't want to live on a planet where we've caused a mass extinction. Um, I mean, it won't. Who knows? It might be like Mad Max. I was trying to think if whether or not I should say that, but it might be. It might look like a dystopia where we all just have to fend for ourselves, and that sounds awful, at least to me. So all of this happening, gotta return back to good old fashioned global climate change. And as a reminder, with biodiversity loss happening, especially not only after the dispersal of humans, from Africa and to other places, slowly happening through tens of thousands of years, just within the Industrial Revolution in the mid 19th century, kickstarted a lot of things. And so we have data showing that since the 1900s, or since 1900, the Earth's average temperature has increased by around 1 degree Celsius. And going back to 1970 being a really important benchmark, two-thirds of this rise has happened since 1980. So we have an awareness really kicking up, at least in the global west, which is controlling a lot of the Anthropocene, at least at this part of the 20th century. You have an increased awareness in 1970, but two-thirds of this 1 degree Celsius raise has happened since then. So that's just something to kind of think about, like what does the role of awareness actually do? And that isn't for us to like sink into despair, but something to just kind of munch on throughout the rest of the 5 weeks of class. So on that happy note, welcome to the fabulous Anthropocene era. So, the forces of anthropogenic global climate change have accelerated over the past few centuries, leading some to argue that the Earth has entered a new epoch called the Anthropocene, the period in Earth history when humans have come to dominate global geological, ecological, and climatological processes. So, with the Anthropocene, some environmental problems, such as local air pollution and regional wildlife population declines, date back centuries or even millennia. But the Anthropocene is defined by a range of increasingly serious and complex local, regional, and global environmental problems. So, in some regions, some environmental problems have improved. In the US, for example, we've had some improvements in water quality, air quality, and habitat restoration and protection, especially since industrialization, like I said, around the 1850s. But other places have not. And even with improvements, they're messy and complicated, and sometimes they ripple out in ways that can't be um, can't even be prepared for. And that all has to do with everything that humans do impacts the system of systems. And that's why we're in the era called the Anthropocene. So It isn't necessarily inherently bad or wrong for humans to change the environment. I mean, everything changes, that's part of life. And it's also natural for humans to want to leave a mark on the environment. What these marks do, what these marks mean, have been part of philosophical debate for thousands of years. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they all wanted to think about what all of their work meant, what the work of other, great people at the time would mean. What does it mean to create a huge building? What does it mean to, create an empire? We don't really know, but what we do know is that it'll change what the future looks like. We just don't know what it'll look like. So a couple forces of anthropogenic environmental change can include, but are not limited to, migration, agriculture, urbanization, industrialization, resource extraction, pollution, domestication, interactions with wild species, and more. So again, anthropogenic, anthropo meaning human, genic meaning I think from them. So all of these things are human centered. It is migration is humans moving. Agriculture is humans making planting plants in rows and then harvesting them all together. Urbanization is people making social areas in one space and then growing them through technology and other advancements to look something like this. Industrialization, same thing. Resource extraction is humans taking things out, and so on. And so this is why, again, we are in the Anthropocene, this human-centered geologic era. So a way to think about this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about if we can create technology to solve all of our environmental problems, is this equation called I equals PAT. So, and this is a way for us to think about anthropogenic change. So in 1970, Barry Commoner, Paul R. Ehrlich, and John Holdren produced this equation after researching how technology produced after World War II led to enviro degradation. I will just say, ooh, peep that 1970 again. So in this equation, I equals environmental impact. P is human population, conceived this way. So births minus deaths plus immigration minus emigration. Affluence, which is consumption, and technology, or T is technology. So environmental impact is population times affluence times technology. So this is because human population is a major force of environmental change. So let's get into this P. Let's get into this population issue. We will be talking about environmental impacts a bit today, but also for the next 5 weeks. But I really want to focus on the PAT part of I equals PAT. So human population, major force. Demographers, so these are people who study populations, estimate that around 106 billion with a B, people have lived throughout the history of our species. If that is true, that means about 6% of the people that ever lived are alive today. It's actually probably more than that. I haven't checked this number since last year, so it's probably closer to 7%. So that has something to do with carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the total population or amount of a thing that can be sustained in each area. So when a population is below its carrying capacity, it will increase in size. And then this is when birth rate exceeds death rate. So we can see carrying capacity right here. And yeah, carrying capacity is a way to understand population, whether it is of species, but also of people. So population versus consumption. We're going to get into consumption a little bit, but let's see it kind of in action. So this is just a quick case study that I took from an early version of ES1 that I do not teach. And let's get into it a little bit. So India, along with other developing countries, has long argued that it should be able to grow its economy without major environmental restrictions because developed nations created most of today's environmental problems, and because it still has a long way to go to meet its people's needs. Today, India is democratic but lacking equitably distributed resources. It has a population of about 1.33 billion. I think that has changed in the past year. And it is one of the world's largest fossil fuel emitters, but its emissions per capita is only a third of the global average and 1/10 of the North American average. So we have a place with a lot of people, 1.33 billion people, but not as much consumption. So something India here kind of makes us think, well, what is more important? Is it population or is it consumption? Is it how much the population is able to consume? Is that really matters? Is it that they're not consuming as much? That it does it have to do with them not having potentially like choices to consume, or that there are issues between the distribution of wealth? There's lots of things, but before we get too kind of lost in that, let's continue working through human population, and then we'll talk a little bit more about affluence in a minute. So what you really need to know about human population when studying the environment are these things. There are multiple theories and ideologies. There's no simple or straightforward relationship. This is going to be more complex than simply size and growth. It's these there's going to be different factors that are also complex and dynamic. There are different stories that change over space and time. Race, gender, class, sexuality, and access to resources, all of these things matter. So a caveat that I did not put on the slide, but I want to emphasize, and in the lecture on the tragedy of the commons, I will also continue to emphasize, is that when we talk about population and when we talk about environmental impacts coming from population, um, some people will take that as an excuse to say that there should just be less people on the planet, period. That opinion is an opinion, and it has been used historically by folks who are eugenicists. We've actually had one on campus in the 70s at UCSB. We will talk about him next week. But when we're talking about population and environmental impact, um, like I said, like the bullet points say, these are complex, these are dynamic, and part of the complexities and a lot of the dynamics are coming from race, class, gender, sexuality, capitalism, access to resources, access to birth control, access to choice, access to agency. Yeah, and when we talk about population, it isn't just there just needs to be less, or even other things which I've heard that are very inappropriate, but like jokes about well, we just need a world war, or we just need a plague, which I have heard and I've actually heard in environmental studies classrooms. And I just want to preface that no, when we talk about population, human population especially, and we talk about environmental impacts, we are not calling for having less people. We are calling for maybe potentially more management of the other aspects of I equals PAT, like affluence. So affluence is consumption. Affluence is basically how much money you have to buy things that could impact the environment. And this is a major force of environmental change. So one of the most popular models that holds that increased affluence can ultimately lower environmental impacts is the environmental Kuznets curve, which you may have experienced in ES2 and 3. If you haven't, we'll continue to get into it throughout throughout the quarter. This model holds that while there's an initial period of increased environmental impact, the total impact will decrease with increasing, sorry, the total impact will decrease with increasing affluence. So the more money you got, the apparently less likely that environmental impacts will happen. That doesn't always hold, but it can. So affluence is a major force of environmental change because while this may be true in some countries, in some circumstances, does not consider the kind of like the transnational world. So when we're talking about affluence just fixing things, this doesn't apply to everywhere with different people, policies, and trade, because all of these things complicate things. Countries with extreme affluence, such as the US, can and tend to exploit the environments of less affluent countries while seeking to protect their own. I'm looking at you, pharmaceutical companies who are going to the tropics to take tropical plants and make medication and then charge way, way too much for it, especially for poor people. Thank you so much. Yeah, so affluence doesn't fix anything or doesn't fix everything. Money can fix some things, but it can't fix everything, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And and talking about affluence this way, this is not only a transnational issue, there are going to be discrepancies that can and do occur within the same countries. And I hate that I just could take the same exact slide that I used in the last time I taught this and I could just plug it back in, which is that Flint, Michigan still does not have adequate drinking water, and they have not since at least April 2014. There was a project to replace all water pipes in the city that is supposed to be finished in July 2020, but I think we all know what happened last year, and you can bet your bottom dollar that Flint, Michigan still does not have water. And the water still looks that on a good day. And a lot of times it's worse. And that is heinous, and that is in the US. More about affluence. So wealthier countries, and when we say wealthier countries, we mean those with a higher GDP per capita, tend to have larger ecological footprints. So an ecological footprint is the measure of ecological assets that a population requires to produce the natural resources to consume and absorb its waste, basically carbon emissions. So the bigger the country or the bigger the GDP, most likely the biggest ecological footprint. So this footprint can be compared to an area's biocapacity or the productivity of its ecological assets, which then can absorb waste. So, for example, bamboo can absorb 5 times more carbon than most other trees. Of course, I have to include a tree fact. Thank you so much. If you want to calculate yours, the footprintnetwork.org will let you do that with a footprint calculator. It is a really cool place to start, and it will make suggestions about not only what your footprint is, but what you can try to do about it to lower it. I think it's really neat. It can border on a little depressing though. Because there's really no simple or straightforward environmental result when we think about affluence. So money can increase or reduce your impact. There's going to be multiple competing theories about what to do about it. And that's because a lot of people put much more stake in affluence than even the environment, doing things for richness now, and bypassing thinking about richness for the future, or different kinds of richness besides money. Now let's talk about technology, and we certainly will be talking about technology in future lectures. But technology is the last part of the iPad equation, and scholars have pointed to technology as a driving force of environmental change. So foremost among these is a suite of technologies that have enabled the large-scale exploitation of fossil fuels. So at the bottom left, you can see a little Prius C. I have almost that exact car. She's just in a darker color, and I have driven that exact road. So it's basically like you're seeing a snapshot of me. This is also when we talk about technology, especially because we're at UCSB or we're attending Zoom University through UCSB, we have to think about oil. We have to think about just different kinds of natural resources that are being extracted to make the technology. But let's get into it. So technology is a major force of environmental change. And again, there's no simple or straightforward relationship. It can increase or reduce impact, and there's going to be consequences depending on the content and use of whatever the technology is. So, for example, I sure do love my little hybrid, but the batteries for it, at least as they are made right now, are not the most sustainable and require lots and lots of mining to get the minerals that you need um, to make the batteries possible. And that's true for all sorts of batteries. And the extraction tends to happen in the US, for example, but and sometimes the batteries are made elsewhere, but sometimes they're made in I bet you would guess lower affluent neighborhoods in the US even. So it is hard when we're talking about population, affluence, and technology. These things are separate, but they're also very entangled. Whenever we're talking about the environment, these things are really working hand in hand. So the environment can be viewed, if we're going to just kind of tie everything together, because I'm looking at the clock, the environment can be viewed as a self-regulating system that can endure a certain level of impact. It can't just take everything. I mean, um, an asteroid took out the dinosaurs after all. But the maximum and durable impact is the carrying capacity, like we talked about. And if that impact is less than the carrying capacity related to the human population's affluence, so remember affluence, consumption, and then the technology, then the impact can continue. But if the impact is more than the carrying capacity, then it will be in a state of something called overshoot, which can degrade the ability for the environment to recover, which in turn can lower the area's carrying capacity and changing things for the future. We can measure impact using specific criteria such as land cover, change, or carbon emissions, but overall impact is really hard to quantify because the environment, again, and I will probably repeat this for the next 5 weeks, is a complex system of systems. It is a labyrinth inside a labyrinth. And when we're considering anthropogenic influences, it is better to think about interactions or relationships than impacts. We will likely still be calling them impacts because that's what they're called in the broader world. But instead of thinking about an impact being one action, it's more it makes more sense, and it is truer to the experience to actually call them interactions or relationships, indicating that there are multiple things going on that have specific relationships to each other, specific connections to one another, rather than, just saying, well, if this happens, then this one event will happen. Because, of course, the environmental impacts that we're talking about aren't just one event or, just one flash in time, one, specific place, et cetera, et cetera. These are kind of like states of being that will continue to ripple out and impact the whole entire system. So, how are people transforming the environment? Well, do I have a lot of different ways, but here are some of the main ones. So, natural and anthropogenic forces interact and therefore are difficult to separate, yet we know that people have been shaping their environments for millennia. So, think the Indus River Valley and early development of agriculture if you want to or can harken back to an earlier world history class. Also, for most of human history, these changes have happened very slowly, but during the past 250 years, but especially in the last 80 years since World War II, there's been a dramatic increase in human population, affluence, resource consumption, technology, and in turn, environmental change. So in using formulas like the ecological footprint, that IPA, I must have just been thinking about going to a local brewery that should say IPAT. It provides starting points for thinking about human interactions with non-human nature. But they're only the beginning for our understanding of the complex ways humans shape environmental change. So, how are people transforming the environment? So, we are limited by nature, but we also build on nature. We destroy old natures, but we also create new natures. We dominate nature, but we're also dominated by nature. We are created by nature, but we also seek to control nature. We manage nature. We interact with nature. We transform nature. A lot of these things go both ways. A lot of these things show that we're in a really kind of symbiotic relationship with nature, which is something that I think for the next lecture we I will tell you about this longer history of people having what people have thought through time about their connection with nature. Um, we are a little short on time, but I would see, did I? Sorry, I'm just checking. Okay. Right now, I want you to do this uh, as our attendance question. So think about you read and you watched Rachel Carson's you read Fable for Tomorrow and we watched the DDT video yesterday, this warning against a silent spring, her call for an end to DDT. How do you think that reflects how people impact the environment? So so I want you to just use the chat and I want you to answer this question. So thinking about IPAT that we just talked about today, how do you think the warning against silent spring kind of play a role in understanding that environmental issue, in thinking about the overuse of DDT? Just it doesn't it's just a quick little note. I just want to make sure that I have you as here. I did lose track of time a bit because I got lost a little bit in talking about affluence. I ask your forgiveness on that. But yeah, just take a couple minutes, think about how Rachel Carson's warning against a silent spring and her call for an end to DDT reflects how people impact the environment. Put it in the chat. Ready, set, go. April asked a great question in the chat a couple minutes ago. When we're talking about impacts, are we assuming that all of them are negative? I know most of them are. I think that's a great question. And actually, no, not everything is negative. And some of the things that we will examples that we'll be talking about, especially in weeks 3 to the end, we'll talk about some really great examples, some really creative ways that humans have tried to enact change in a positive way. Some of them are successful, some, but also some of these solutions end up just being to stop what they're doing or to just find a different way to do what they need to do. So I hope that answers your question, but I will say that, you know, some, not everything is negative. Okay, I'm getting some of these in. Keep them coming. Take another minute or so. And again, there is not a right or wrong way to answer this question. No answer is too obvious, frankly, I forgot to put in an attendance question for today, so this is me springing one on you. Um, Full disclosure. So take another minute. While they come in, I just want to end with this point. So hopefully you listen to the review of Sycamore Trees. Uh, Also, full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of John Green. He's one of my favorite living writers. His most recent book is called The Anthropocene Reviewed, based on his podcast that you listen to an episode of, and it's really beautiful. At least I think. But from his review of the sycamore tree, I just kind of want to read this part, because after talking about how being in the Anthropocene, how the Anthropocene happened, and what is now happening because of it, understanding we're in a geologic time period predicated by human actions can be a scary one and can also lead to despair. And so I just kind of want to leave you with this from the review of Sycamore Trees. So when my brain is playing what's even the point, hope feels so flimsy and naive, especially in the face of the endless outrages and horrors of human life. What kind of mouth breathing jackass looks at the state of human experience and responds with anything other than nihilistic despair? But of course, the problem with despair is that it isn't very productive. Like a replicating virus, all despair makes is more of itself. If playing what's even the point made me a more committed advocate for justice or environmental protection, I'd be all for it. But the white light of despair instead renders me inert and apathetic. I struggle to do anything. I often can't find a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Um, that's something that I really appreciate as someone who experiences anxiety and depression, and as somebody who studies the environment. Sometimes when I think, especially when I'm teaching this topic, but sometimes when I'm just dealing with kind of a longer historical view of how things have changed. Um, when I think about how redwoods used to be all over the world and now they're only on a little couple 100-mile long stretch of California coastline, I get super duper sad. Um, and that is called ecological or environmental anxiety or eco grief. And that is something that I think is really important to acknowledge, and we will talk about more as we go along. I just kind of wanted to highlight that if at all, whether it was even before this class or after hearing this lecture, or as the class goes on, if you find yourself being overwhelmed by the state of the world, I think that that is a healthy response. If you don't feel overwhelmed, there's nothing wrong with you. I'm just kind of jealous. But I want to acknowledge that this is an absolute normal reaction, something that we'll be talking about. And hopefully through this class and through learning more about what's going on, you'll find yourself feeling more empowered and more in line and more prepared to, hopefully do something about it. What that looks like is really dependent on you, whether it's just kind of an awareness that you share with your community, or it becomes a career, or it just becomes making different consumer choices, or anything. It's really easy when we talk about the environment to think about, well, what's even the point of doing anything? But there are lots of points, and I'm hoping that for the next 5 weeks that we can, really get into that. So for next time, again, remember the next week is asynchronous. I will be hugging trees. I will have everything uploaded for you by the weekend for the rest of the week. I will be still accessible by email. It will just take me about 24 hours, up to 24 hours to respond. Before next class, before the recorded lecture for Monday, you should read The Trouble with Nature, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature, which is a long article. It is I need to emphasize it's about 20 pages. It is very good. It is written by William Cronin, who is a really cool environmental historian. He is like a living legend in my field. But it is longer. It's also like really popular, and you may have already read it or you'll encounter it later. So it is a good piece to read. Another piece that's smaller is called Man and Nature, George Perkins Marsh and Alexander von Humboldt. I do need to emphasize that, especially in the latter piece, but even in the trouble with nature, a lot of this history is going to be filled with white men, and in fact, at least one of these was written by a white man. Um, which isn't to say that it's only been white men who have experienced or had anything to do with nature. However, the history of people talking about nature and having that talking be reflected and made into archivable material that could later be written about, I do have to acknowledge has mostly been white men. Of course, different indigenous folks have had different experiences with the land. People of color, especially Black and African American folks in the US, especially, have had different interactions with nature. I'm thinking, of course, of enslaved peoples, but all of this is to say is that these readings are full of white men, and this is only one part of the story. However, when we're talking about the history of environmental thought, these are some of the reflections that have been written down. And I'm in my lecture, I try to push back on that as much as I can, including other voices. But unfortunately, much of environmentalism, especially up into the 1950s and 60s, has mostly been white men. And so much of what we have on this topic is going to be white and male. And yeah, and this is all all to say, and all in preparation for the topic for our next lecture, which is what are historical perspectives of the environment. And I think that is it. I am going to stop sharing. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around. If you don't have questions, once you've put in your attendance question, feel free to go. So have